Good morning, Phoenix, and welcome to the House of Mystery radio show. This is the place to come for true crime, conspiracy, and alternative history. Only on KFNX 1100 Independent Talk Radio. We're here every Saturday morning, 6 to 7 a.m., and I'm your host, Al Warren. You're back in the House of Mystery, and today we're covering a slightly different murder case, and one that a lot of you have asked for, is about the Phantom Killer. And with us today, we've been joined by an excellent author. He's written the definitive book on the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, is another name we'd call it, with the Phantom Killer, and we've got James Presley. Thanks very much for being on the show.
It's a privilege to be here, Alan.
So, now, how did you get involved in writing about this case?
Well, I grew up in Texarkana, which is the home of the Phantom Killer. And as a young boy, I lived through some of that. And it was a horrifying time, and everyone was terrified. And I recall as a boy that my father was working swing shift, and I was an only child, so my mother and I were alone until midnight each night. Well, you had the Phantom Killer lurking, and no one knew where he was, who he was, or where he would strike next. So it was a time that you kept a gun handy and slept fitfully, and at least we did until midnight came, and soon after, my father would come back, and I think we all relaxed then. But this was replicated in a lot of other homes at that time, and some of them maybe having scarier experiences than we did. At the time, my uncle, Bill Presley, was the sheriff of Bowie County, Texas. I have to explain that Texarkana is a twin city. It's divided by the Arkansas-Texas state lines. So the crimes happened on both sides of town. They were outside the city limits on both sides, and the first 3 of the 4 episodes were on the Texas side, and then the 4th one was over on the Arkansas side. So this was a time that really scary time for, I think, everyone involved. I think everyone, in fact, as far as Little Rock, people have told me they were scared to death of the Phantom back then. This was in 1946. And at least as far as 60 miles west of Texarkana on the Texas side, and I'm sure up in Oklahoma is not too far, and maybe into Louisiana, which is not that distant from Texarkana. So it terrorized the entire region, and at that time, the news media, which was nothing like we have today, the news media picked it up during about the middle of it, and this added to the tension and to the notoriety as it came to be. So this was a time, I think of Charles Dickens' introductory lines in A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Because this happened in the late winter and spring of 1946. See, this was just a few months after the end of World War II. So it was a time of flux, not only in the U.S., but all over the world, and certainly Texarkana was a microcosm of that. Because the events after the end of World War II left unemployment, and you had the servicemen returning back. So that was the best of times. The war was over. But it was also the worst of times in that there was uncertainty, especially economic uncertainty throughout the nation. And you will get down to Texarkana and you find the same thing there. The employment rate was high. And a lot of the GIs returning from the war went to college on the GI Bill, and some were married and got jobs or looked for jobs. So it was kind of a time that it really left uncertainty all over the area. And then this episode, this spree of the so-called Phantom Killer, stretched from February the 22nd, 1946, to May the 3rd of 1946. See, that's a little over 2 months. And during that time, there were 4 separate episodes. In the first one, on February the 22nd, there was a couple, married but not to each other, savagely beaten in a lover's lane north of Texarkana. And the man was beaten and almost really wasn't expected to live for a while until he slowly recovered. The woman was also beaten, and she was, as she put it, was terribly abused, but she was not raped. Now, this was an episode that was not connected by the officers to the other murders that were to come until some time later. Now, both of these victims lived, and because, as I said, they were married but not to each other, a lot of officers jumped to the conclusion there must be, an unhappy lover or something, or maybe a mate of one of them, but none of that could be proved because it wasn't true. They both insisted that the man was vicious, and the male victim, Jimmy Hollis, said that this man, if you don't catch him, he's going to kill it next time. Said he thought he'd kill me. And these turned out to be true predictions. Now, the other thing that was a problem in this case of the first one of the beatings was that the man and the woman both disagreed about the identity of the man. It was at night, and late night, and she thought he was a black man wearing a mask, and he thought he was sure he was a white man, not over 30 years old, and he didn't see a mask. So you see, there's a discrepancy there.
Yeah.
And the officers jumped to the conclusion, as I said, that there was something else involved there, because when you have situations like this very often, and I think most lawmen agree with this, that the victims and the perpetrators know each other. Well, this was not true. They both said, no, we didn't know, I never saw him before, and so forth. The way he was snarling, it was, terrible. But this delayed things, even though it remained used for several days, but nothing came of it. And then about a month later, on March the 24th, a couple, Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17, were found shot to death in his car west of the city, outside the city limits, in a different location, but not, terribly far from where the other event happened. They were both shot in the back of the head, execution style, and there was no known motive. They checked everybody who could have known them, but nothing. They could find nothing. Now, they did not connect this at all with the earlier incident. So things rocked along. Texarkana was really a rough little town back then. It had 2 defense plants operating full steam during the war, and so there was a lot of violence during that time. And it was not known as a peaceable city even long before then. And one lawman told me that back then Texarkana was calloused to murder. And there'd been, I went through the old newspapers, and that's pretty well true. So this first murder was a double murder. It was unusual that it was a double murder, but there's nothing to be discovered about it, and it rocked along, and Texas Rangers came in too to help. And they'd both been shot by a .32 automatic pistol. And the FBI came into this one too, because in Texarkana, the assumption would be that they could cross the state line very easily, which would bring the FBI in. On that assumption, they came and did some of the investigation. But the crime scene was just muddled in this case, the first double murder. Terribly muddled. People that came by and they gawked, looking, messed up tracks. It was just a terrible crime scene. And things rocked along. Nothing came of that. And then on April the 14th, 3 weeks later, on Palm Sunday in 1946, another couple, these were teenagers, were found murdered in Spring Lake Park, which was a recreation area outside the city limits of Texarkana, then on the Texas side. Paul Martin, 16, Betty Jo Booker, 15. Now, their bodies weren't found together. They were about a mile apart. And as it turned out later, he had been killed first, and then she was killed sometime later. Now, there's a pattern that each of these people who had been killed had been shot twice, exactly twice. Now, Paul Martin was shot 4 times, but as it turned out, at different times, two shot burst each time. And his body was found early that morning by a couple driving through on their way to see relatives that Sunday morning. And her body was found around noon later on in the day after a search party had spread out. Now, this is what changed everything, because the ballistics study showed that the same .32 automatic pistol that killed Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore had also killed Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. So you have 4 murders, 2 double murders, and there never, to my knowledge, been a double murder in the city before, in their area rather. So this immediately threw everything into overdrive. And additionally, these are young victims, and especially the second double murder, teenagers, boy and a girl, really.
Yeah. And
all of them were parked in Lover's Lane that had been safe, about as safe as you could be. You know, Texarkana is not altogether a safe place, but if you stayed away from the hot spots, well, you know, you were probably going to be safe. But
do we know if these couples were connected in any way?
No, there was no connection. This is another thing. They just couldn't find anybody in the earlier case. And in other cases, you know, they couldn't find any connection with anyone, although hundreds of people before it's over were brought in and interrogated, and with no results, even though they had one fellow, the black fellow, whose car tracks were found near the scene where Betty Jo Booker's body was found, and he failed the lie detector test over and over, and but turned out through a use of hypnosis, they were able to get at the truth, and he was trying to conceal a paramour relationship. There's a reason he lied about that, but he was cleared after they checked everything, but there were other cases like that. But he was one that looked like he was headed for death row for a while.
Now, they were both shot, both couples. Did nobody else in Lover's Lane hear the gunfire?
Well, these were late at night, and on the Martin Booker case, the second double murder, it happened. She had played at a VFW dance with a band which mostly was teenagers, which was a holdover from the war when all of the older musicians had gone to war. And so they didn't finish until, around 1 o'clock. So a lot of the people parked. There may have been some there, but then later they had dispersed, and I guess they were about the only ones left there. And they were virtually kidnapped from their car and then taken out, as it turned out later. Then he was shot, and then the girl was taken and then elsewhere, and then they came back, and he had moved over. They saw the body had moved across the road, so he came and shot him again, and that killed him. So that was the reason of the 4 shots, but 2 shot burst. No one. Now on the girls, she was shot, I think, around 5 in the morning or something like that. Now, one farmer had a large farm in the river bottom. He was up early that morning, and he heard a shot. He didn't hear 2, but apparently he just missed one of them because she was shot twice, and she was not shot in the back of the head. These were not. They were not shot execution style because she was shot facing the gunman. But he heard a shot, but wondered why on a Sunday morning someone would be, shooting like that. But then forgot about it and went about his business. And this was when pandemonium took place. As one newsman said, all hell broke loose then because you had young people, you had a pattern now. Now the term serial killing was not in vogue then, but when they found that the ballistics test showed that 4 of these people had been killed with the same gun then, and by an unknown assailant. This terrified people, and overnight the town changed. And then, since there had been a 3-week interval from the first double murder to the second, people started counting and thought, well, is this a pattern? Is he, they've only got one example there, but this is the way people were thinking then. And so they were looking for another such shooting, which would have been May the 4th. But in the meantime, the governor had sent all of Company B of several Rangers, Texas Rangers, to the scene. And along to lead them was Ranger Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez. He was already famous and very colorful, and most of the glamour that had been preceding him was true. Some experts attributed that he had killed as many as 75 men in the line of duty. And one of his biographers, though, carefully went over and decided, no, that was a gross exaggeration. Gonzalez himself would never say it, said that's not true. But the biographer turned out that he said he had only killed 25 in the line of duty. But this added to it because it was just like a movie star coming to town. By that time, you had the national press. You had, after the early murders, you had newsmen from the region, from Dallas, Little Rock, and so forth, Shreveport coming in. Then soon you had newspaper people from all over the country, virtually, from one coast to the other. And the mutual broadcasting system, the old Blue Network, even did a coast-to-coast hookup here, radio, talking about the phantom killing. Now, this time, the lawmen were trying to figure out, investigating as they could to find identity of the killer. But in case he was going to strike again, they set out traps that have lawmen. One would be dressed as a woman, and then be a man with her, and they were hoping that they would attract the killer as a couple there. And I suppose at this time, if the killer had tried to attack a couple in the car, they would have ended up with a Texas Ranger or an Arkansas State Trooper instead of their victim that he might have envisioned. But it was a terrifying time, and so the people, guns and things like that sold, window curtains sold out just like hotcakes. Everyone was terrified, and after the second double murder, the Texarkana Gazette gave a label, a brand to the killer. They call him the Phantom. So this is how the Phantom Killer was born, and as criminologists will tell you that once a serial killer has a brand, that makes him somebody, and that even enhances in his own eyes his greatness. So this came about, but I guess they couldn't just call him the Texarkana Killer because there are a number of candidates for that rule, but not serial killers, which was not, used at that time. So here we are. We've got the Texas Rangers, we've got the national press, and then everyone is looking toward May the 4th, which would be a 3-week interval. And of course, they weren't, sitting quietly before then either, because they really didn't know when he might strike. Then on May the 3rd.
I was going to say there were some rumors too, or something back then about.
Oh, there were rumors, almost, and there were a lot of finger pointing on little of no evidence that so and so is this lawyer's son, the preacher's son, or this or that. It was stuff that had no basis in fact. But and then later the rumors even got worse. In fact, before we get to that third murder scene, the information about the Booker Martin, the second double murder, I read one report in a tabloid that was around this time, it's probably a little after that described the bodies had been mutilated, and that Betty Jo Booker's nude body was found on a barbed wire fence. Well, none of that was true. They were fully clothed, and that's why in the book I used crime scene photos showing that they were fully clothed. In fact, I'd heard one say that her breast and fingers were gnawed, like some bestial assault, and this simply wasn't true. But in the days before television, the rumors were king, and spread, and this added to the terror that people felt. So everyone was looking toward May the 4th, another Saturday night. It'll be a 3 weeks since the April 14th murders. And then on May the 3rd, at that time they'd had several suspects, and they had one down in Corpus Christi, Texas, on the coast. And he had finally been cleared, and Virgil Starks was a farmer on the Arkansas side on the Little Rock Highway, about 8 miles out of Texarkana. And he had had a hard day, and his back was hurting him, and he was resting up, listening to his radio program, and just read the Texarkana Gazette, which had a story about the fellow in Corpus Christi. And his wife, Katie, 36, was in the next room and already gotten ready to go to bed, and called to him and said, Virgil, come on to bed. He said, well, as soon as I finish my program. Well, that was the last she heard, because at that time, someone was outside, and she heard a noise, and she said, called from the other room, Virgil, turn down the radio, I hear something outside. She didn't know whether he ever heard her or not, because just minutes later, someone came up, and he had the window shade halfway up. It'd probably been that way during the daylight hours. In the meantime, the sun had set, and it was dark, and you could see inside with the light on, but he couldn't see outside, and he hadn't pulled the window shade down yet. And the assailant pumped 2 bullets into the back of his head. 2, same as some of the other shots. And he slumped forward. And she didn't hear the shots from the bedroom, but she heard glass breaking. And she went in, and she looked, and there was her husband, and she could tell he was probably dead. So she rushed to an old-fashioned wall telephone there in that room and lifted the receiver, and then the fellow from outside shot her in the head, but not into the brain, but in the lower part. And she had the presence of mind, so she couldn't complete the telephone call for help, but she had the presence of mind to drop to the floor and crawl, because then he couldn't see her, and crawled to another room, and then she heard him breaking in the back of the house, and then she threw caution to the winds, and she dashed pell-mell outside the house, outside the front, across a highway, across a railroad track, to look for help. And the first house no one was there, so she went to the next one. And so the killer apparently had his car parked on the other side of the highway, and of course in the dark he didn't know where she'd gone, and he couldn't see her, and so he apparently drove off. Now she made her way to another house, and they took her to the hospital. She never did see the killer. She did see a leg coming through the window where he was breaking in. That was the extent of it. So all of these victims, no one had seen. The only ones had seen the so-called phantom were the first 2 who survived, but they hadn't seen him clearly, and they had disputed each other as to even about his race. So it's still a mystery, and then this really broke things loose, because not only were the parked couples in cars, but there was a home invasion then, so nobody was safe. And this just added to the terror, which was strong as it could get already. And I think this is summed up in Ken Dixon was an INS reporter who came to town. And incidentally, he came by bus. You think of a reporter who'd been a war correspondent coming from Kansas to Texarkana by bus, when now I don't think anyone newsman would think about even going by train. And he, I think, summed up the situation in his lead, which became often quoted. I have arrived in Texarkana, the home of the Phantom Killer. I've talked to a newspaperman named Graves. I have checked into the Grim Hotel, and the hair is rising on my neck. Now, people out in Texarkana probably didn't see anything unusual about that, because the Graves was Louis Graves, who was the sports editor of the Texarkana Gazette, who would meet the incoming newsman. And the Grim Hotel was a fixture in Texarkana. He was really proud of it. It's named after William Grimm, who was a businessman in Texarkana. So, these are not unusual names there, but outside it practically screamed a message. So at this point, finally, the officers agreed that the first attack on the couple who survived was probably done by the same man. And at the time, there was a lot of belief that the Virgil Stark's murder was also done by the same one. Later, beliefs changed, and some came up with different theories, because he had been shot with a .22 automatic rather than a .32. But then that's not uncommon. Serial killers, of course, there wasn't much known about serial killers then, but hardly anything. But they do change their MO from time to time. There's no other place to find a victim, because you're going to find a lawman cuddle up another lawman if you tried to find a parked couple, probably at that time.
What was the thought of the community then at that time when you've had 3 couples murdered? What was the reasoning? Like, why were these couples being murdered?
I think there was just, they just didn't know. They knew that a killer was loose. He might strike anywhere. He had 4 separate episodes, and he'd killed 5. Katie Starks, the woman, survived, and then the couple at the beginning who were bludgeoned, they survived, but there was no known connection between any of them. And I think it's just the community was just mystified, and some may have had theories, but I don't think they were based in fact.
The very first couple that was just attacked and beaten, there was no gun involved in that.
Yes, he had a gun on him. Yes.
Oh, he did.
He forced the man to drop his trousers. That would disable him. See, you can't run with your trousers around your ankles. And the first man murdered, Richard Griffin, he was found with his trousers down too. So this was a MO of the killer to do this, to disable the male first that way. And it didn't happen in the Martin situation, but that more or less connected those 2 crimes.
I guess the Gazette was telling people that the murderer was caught.
No. They never. No, they. I think there was a rumor went around they had been caught, and there were all kinds of rumors. You can almost make one up now, and it would have been stated by someone at that time. No, there was a rumor that the man had been caught, but the Gazette came back, and the sheriffs on both sides of the town denied it. Now, there was later on that summer, there was a man who became the major suspect, and he was arrested. And the rumor may have had some basis. Some lawman may have let it slip, and they denied it, but they didn't have him charged. They had him on a hot car charge. He never was charged with the murders, but he was a major suspect, and the sheriff, which was Bill Presley at that time on the Bowie County, Texas side, shipped him off to another jail 60 miles away, where an accommodating sheriff took him in. And that was, I think, to prevent the possibility of possibly a lynching, because Texarkana had more than one lynching. Usually were the black people back in the 30s and early 40s. But you could see that people were so charged because of these atrocities that he feared that there might be a attempt to spirit the fellow away and lynch him just on the charge. So he got him out of town, and I would think, I don't know for sure, but I think that's how the rumor got started, that somehow it got out. But then there were other rumors that a man had been caught and confessed, and none of that was true. I think almost any possible rumor you could think of probably had legs of some sort at that time.
Now, did they ever come up with a profile of what the murderer would be?
Well, they didn't then. Now, that's why in the book I did go and made a study of serial killers, which obviously was not available at that time. And since then, how many serial murders have we had? Well, no telling how many, and half or more probably have gone unsolved or even unrecognized. So many have been unrecognized as being serial murders. But they go on even as we speak today, I'm sure. But I tried to go in the book and work up a profile, and I did talk to some psychiatrists. In fact, several years before I began the book, I did a 8-part newspaper series out of my own curiosity. And I did enough to tell me that this is a very complex case and it would be very difficult to work, especially with the passage of time, and so many of the principals dead or gone. So this is one reason I didn't tackle it as a book, even though I'd written a number of other books, but not in the true crime type before then. But it was a difficult thing because to dig up all the information, and but I did learn enough during doing the series, and I talked to people like my uncle Bill Presley. I didn't sit down with a formal interview with him, but we talked off and on about the case for some time, and then I sat down with interviews and tape with people like Max Tackett, who was an Arkansas State trooper at that time, very much involved in the case, and Tillman Johnson, who was chief deputy sheriff on the Arkansas side at that time. In fact, when I was working on the book, Tillman Johnson was still around, and he lived until 97, I think it was, and he was alert right up to the end. And we would talk every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and sometimes as late as 2 a.m. because he stayed up late. And during that time, I did have the earlier research I'd done, and then I'm trained as a historian. And although as a teenager, my first job was as a police reporter for the Texarkana Gazette. This was some time after these murders, but I got to know some of the people who'd investigated on both sides of town, and then I also got to know and talk to some of the reporters who'd covered this case. So it was something that was has become something of folklore in this area, but at that time, the people were fresh in their memories. And that also I might mention that one of the FBI agents who did work on the case, the others said I think it moved past on or whatever, but he was still alive, and I did talk to him by phone. So there were a few people left, and of the victims and their families, some of those were difficult to track down, but that was one of the major research projects thrust to locate what happened to them. And along the way, like I said, as a trained historian, you start looking for documents and primary source material. So I was fortunate in this case to find reports filed in 1946 in the Arkansas State Police files, archives, And through that, I was able to connect the major suspect where he was at the time of the Starks case, and that he did pass through the Starks' home that evening on his way to Texarkana and back, and that he did own both a .32 automatic and a .22 automatic. But he had gotten rid of those weapons, had sold them at one point later on, and they were never recovered. So the evidence is circumstantial, but it's fairly compelling. And it's evidence I certainly didn't expect to find when I set out to write the book. And I really set out to write the book because I've heard so many rumors, and some I knew could not be true, but I thought, well, if this doesn't get taken care of and really a record provided of what can be discerned, then it's going to end up in myth, and whatever people want to put into it will be, and which a lot of cases happens to a lot of cases on the internet these days. So that's why I set up to provide a record and make as much as I could find at that time, and interviewed people I could find, and this included some of the victims' family, those who were still around, and it was quite an adventure.
Yeah.
And very, very at times discouraging, because you're dealing with a very, very cold case, and I was lucky to find and locate some of the people. In fact, one of Richard Griffin's brother, David, younger brother, was still alive at this time. He died just before the book came out. And he and I became good friends as a result of the conversations and during the research on the book. David he had not been, a lot of the victims' families had not been really apprised of what was really going on. And especially the Griffin family, I think, felt, and the Moore family, the first murder victims, felt like they hadn't been given the whole story. And so David, in fact, the Griffin family had a reunion and asked me to come, invited me up, and I did, and spoke and told him at that time what I knew of the case, sometime before the book came out. And David said that was the first time he'd had a sense of closure about that, what happened to his brother. His brother was a World War II Navy veteran who had returned from the Pacific not too long before this happened. So there were the benefits were getting to know some of the family members, and finding material that had not been turned up by other people too. And it was just a lot of hard work, and I knew that was what it was going to be going into it, because after doing the series, newspaper article series, I knew that it was going to be, to make a book would be much, much more difficult, and it was. It did not.
Well, and so, and of the media and even the movies that were made, do you think they did a very good job of telling the crime?
Well, on the movie, The Town at Red Sundown, which also is partly responsible for the continued interest in the case, that it fictionalizes a lot. It's it's a movie, and the only thing wrong is that it said at the beginning. I remember seeing that in a theater in Austin, Texas, where I was at the time. It said everything in here is true as it was. Well, that was not. Pretty soon it was pretty apparent, because it had a scene, and I think this may have added to some of the latter day theories and rumors. It had a scene in which the girl, this would be the Booker Martin case, presumably, the girl was tied to a tree, and the killer wearing a hood over his head with a trombone with knives attached to it, was playing this mournful tune, and each time he'd pierce the girl. And that was, I believe it was played by Dawn Wells. Now, of course, nothing like that happened, but because all of the victims were shot, and except the first two were beaten, and I'm not sure whether they were never sure whether they were beaten with a gun barrel or something else, a bludgeon. It sounded like it was more like some kind of a bludgeon, maybe a window weight. But anyway, I think the images get affixed in the mind, and whether we see it on TV or whether the actual event we actually see, it tends to merge into a sense of reality. And I think that's has affected the perception of this case. And a lot of people have seen that movie. And it was MGM did a remake of it, and I believe it was in 2014. I think it's not too long before the book came out. But that did distort what actually happened. In fact, Tillman Johnson used to get a lot of calls. One couple came from North Carolina, drove over just to talk to him, and the man wanted his picture taken with Tillman Johnson, who had investigated the Phantom case. One fellow came from, no, I don't think he made it here, but he called Tillman, and from, I believe, West Virginia, and he said he'd seen that movie about, I don't know how many times, repeatedly. It was his favorite one. And he said that killer must have been really shrewd to arrange those knives on that trombone. And Tillman said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, he had that knife." He said, "No." Tillman explained that no knife was ever used in any of these crimes.
Yeah.
But see,
yeah.
and here was a man who knew, refuting that, but I'm not sure he convinced him. So there's, and that's, I know it's a stirred a lot, and then the internet has added to it.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
So this is why I wanted to provide a record, and in the process I was able to dig up information that I didn't know existed that clearly points toward this suspect.
Yeah. And do you think there was any reason why he was killing these couples and then just stopped?
Well, this is a complicated thing, but and serial killers don't always have the same motivation. But in this case, revenge with surrogates. Revenge via surrogates seems to be, to me, to be the main factor. Now, this fellow, the major suspect, had gotten out of prison, the Texas prison system, in late December 1945. He spent the World War II behind bars for one reason or another in federal prison system, the Texas prison system, and in the Arkansas prison system too. So he had a variety of experience. But he was out and returned to Texarkana in late December 1945. So he's on the scene. And he had a tattoo. I was able to go through the prison system's archives and found they keep records on the inmates. And I found one that they had picked up. They have a place for tattoos. And he had one with revenge on it. And this may have been well, you know, that's a pretty big signal. Someone puts a tattoo, it's a message, whatever it says. And I think there's a lot of anger, and I was able to delve in through another thing I didn't expect to find. That I found out very cooperative from members of his family, a niece and nephew, who knew and had, one of them had family correspondence at that time. So that gave me some insights I otherwise wouldn't have had. But I can imagine someone spending so many years behind bars in the variety of prison systems that there'd be some anger built up. This seems to have been true of him. And in the case of the first beating, there was a precursor event there that may have had a factor in that. This major suspect and his girlfriend, who later became his wife, and when she became his wife, she could not they could not force her to testify against her husband. Presumably that was the reason he had married her there, just the same day that she was later arrested and started giving statements eventually to implicate him in the Spring Lake Park, the little boy and girl murders. But he had experience in which another fellow had made a play for this girlfriend, wife-to-be, and he had warned him and said, the guy really took her away from him. And this was, I guess, must have been humiliating. And the attack on the first couple happened sometime after that. Now, Max Tackett, one of the leading investigators, speculated that probably he stole a car. He didn't own a car of his own, stole a car and went over there and in the area close to where her parents lived and saw this parked car and thought perhaps that's who it was, the girlfriend and the other fellow. It wasn't. It was someone he totally did not know. And the speculation was that he was wreaking his vengeance on them. As it turned out, they would have been surrogates for the real persons. But that's what serial killers tend to do. The people they kill are people they do not know, but they sort of stand in place of those they have an animus against. Now, before the Starks murder, there's another situation in which they had been boarding in Arkansas with another couple who was his girlfriend, wife-to-be's sister, and her husband. And there was a dispute because he hadn't paid any board money to help out. They'd been there for some time. They had a big, hot argument, and they were asked to leave. So he was in a foul mood. Then he came in to Starks, had a welding shop there, and he probably saw that, and the speculation would be, and went to see if something he could steal and sell, and then saw the light on, and saw he was still in a bad mood, and if this theory were correct, well then again he'd be killing surrogates for his original anger. Very rarely does a serial killer kill someone they know because that would connect them directly to their victim. As one criminologist said, that's the last thing they want to be connected to. So there's a lot of psychologically, there's a lot of clues to the behavior. But as I said, each serial killer is working within his own experience, his own personal history, and so forth. So it's hard to say everyone behaves exactly the same way. But there seems to be a general profile that killing well, it may be revenge or it may be for other motives, but they're killing at maybe not at random, because these also usually are crimes of opportunity. And these victims, they just happen to be in wrong place at the wrong time, but they were not doing anything, that they deserved any kind of punishment for. They were just minding their own business.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I guess we'll never really know.
Well, so much to be locked up in the mind of the killer himself, and I think even very few, if any, of these serial killers who do these crimes probably even really realize exactly what's going on in their own mind, except that to see the victim, And sometimes this is very spontaneous. I read of one case which this woman drove home. She stopped the car, the door still open, the engine still running, and to check her mailbox. And that was the way the car was found, and she was gone. Apparently the killer had come by, seen her, crime of opportunity, pulled a gun on her, put her in his car, took her off, killed her somewhere else. So, see, that had to be a crime of opportunity. Now, something like this apparently happened in these other cases. The major suspect had told his wife-to-be that in the Spring Lake Park where the two kids were, he said, well, this car, Paul Martin had driven his brother's car from another town for their date that night, and so it was shined up and looked nice, and he said to his wife-to-be, he said, these people should have some money, let's go see. And then this one thing led to another, and may not have set out to kill, but one thing led to another, did. And then robbery too was a factor in all of these, but it seems to me that was petty robbery was secondary.
So now, how do people get a hold of you, or do you have a website for people if they want to?
No, I don't have a website. I suppose through the publisher Pegasus Books in New York.
Okay. And your book is sold at all stores and at Amazon, and we'll have the connection on our website as well.
Yeah, it's on in the bookstores and so forth everywhere, I guess. In fact, recently there's a large print edition. I think it's already out, and then there's a audio version also, and then the paperback edition came out earlier this year.
Well, it's been a very interesting hour. Well, thank you very much for sharing your research and information on your book.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your interest.
Show is over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be back.